there's lots of people say, oh, that isn't true, that never happened, there never was such and such a thing, never was this, that, or the other. But if a fellow can give a pretty correct description and something that they can tie to, why, it's there forever.
Well, can you tell me how it started and where it came? I mean, how much they did of it before they were stopped?
Yes, I can tell you about as I did the boy.
That'd be good.
But what are you most interested in?
Well, any recollections that you have of the early days. Whatever you'd like to tell me.
Well, they're after me for first this, that, and the other. Oftentimes they're very anxious to know about the early days schools.
Yes.
And then the roads and the bridges.
You know about those.
And Cascadel, the lumber companies, of course, and Cascadel has quite a history back of it. And I'll tell you all I can about any of it.
Well, would you like to start with Cascadel?
Well, now here's another. Is that thing on now?
Doesn't matter. We've got lots of tape. So yes, we'll when we edit it, we'll take out all the extra stuff. You know, we'll just cut that out, and then we'll have it for just with the stories on it.
Well, now starting with Cascadel. In the very early days, Cascadel was known as Alder Creek by the old-timers. There are a great many alders grow along the creek.
Yeah.
Up until about 1877, why, there were not many people got to the mountains. Some few hunters and some few trappers and some prospectors, but they never was much gold found beyond the Fine Gold Creek down here. And while there was a little mining up above Cascadel and a considerable up around the Jackass Meadows, there never was any gold found in paying quantities that I ever knew of. But the year 1877 was a very dry year in the San Joaquin Valley.
I've heard that. That winter was a real strange one, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you must take into consideration in a story like this that there was no irrigation in the San Joaquin Valley then. There was no alfalfa. There was no vineyards. There was just a little grain farming. And the only way they had of getting water, they could dig a well, but the only way they had of getting water was to lift it with a couple of buckets. And it was hard to water a few thousand head of sheep with a couple of buckets.
I should think so.
So early in the spring of 1877, most all the sheepmen left the valley from all parts of Madera and Fresno and Merced County and went back into the mountains anywhere they could get. You understand, there was no Forest Service at that time. There was no regulations. It was just a case of get up and go. They had to get back there, first of all, because they had a great deal of trouble watering their sheep after the warm weather set in, and there was no feed in the valley to amount to anything. But when they got up to around the 2,500, 3,000 foot level, they began to find quite a little feed. And they went back as the snow went off in the higher country, where they kept going back and went clear back to the summit. And But most all of those sheepmen had families to take care of as well as sheep, and so they just got back to about what is now 77 kraals, and left a few men taking care of all the sheep. They let the sheep mix up, and a few men stayed back there and took care of them, and the other men went out and done the best that they could for their families. And in the fall time, why, they gathered the sheep all up in one bunch, and at the 77 kraals, they built a large log kraal. The kraal contained a great many acres, and they gathered the sheep in that and drove them all out of the mountains together. They perhaps had 125,000 sheep. And when they got out mostly to Oakhurst, or what was then Fresno Flats, why, they divided them up there, and some of them went over into Fresno County, and some of them went to Merced County, and some of them, a good many of them, stayed in Madera County. We've both been having the flu.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, don't get overtired now.
No.
Because I can come back another time.
Well, we'll kind of go ahead with this for this time.
Okay.
Well, now, during that year, 1877, there was a C.E. Strivens, Charlie Strivens, as he was known mostly. He come up to Cascadel, and there was a sheepman, George Wagner, had claimed Cascadel as his squatter claim. In the early days, they had squatter claims. They had no right except well, they called it a six-shooter right.
Oh, squatters.
And, well, Mr. Strivens settled there, and perhaps planted the first apple trees that were planted at Cascadel. Rita, give me a little of that cough syrup, will you, please? I haven't been coughing about anything.
Oh, it's just the talking. Well, just don't, we can, one that planted the first trees, you think?
No, Strivens.
Strivens, yeah.
Yeah, Strivens. He had put up a little store there, and sold such things as he could get. It was hard to get things. Everything had to be hauled mostly from Stockton in those days by horse team or ox team. But he sold whiskey.
Always.
Some little groceries and some little dry goods and what he could get. Well, the Indians didn't know the meaning of the white man's word Alder Creek, but they called it, first started to call it Alder. Well, when they got better acquainted with it and could get liquor there, and the liquor was called whiskey, why, the Indians changed the name from Alder Creek to Whiskey Creek.
So that's how it got its name.
Because they could understand the whiskey part of it, and that's all they could understand, I guess. Well, now, Mr. Strivens continued on there for a year or two during the summer months, and then he owed a big bill to a storekeeper in Madera, H.S. Williams. Early timers will know that name. And Mr. Williams took to quarters claim over for what
Oh, I see.
Scrivens owned him.
Uh-huh.
And Mr. Williams became the owner of it.
Mhm.
Well, Mr. Williams had a J.E. Chapin who was one of the first supervisors of Madera County when Madera County was cut off from Fresno County in 1893. Why, Mr. Chapin was appointed by the governor as one of the first supervisors of Madera County.
I see.
And Mr. Chapin was a Michigan man, a highly educated man, a very fine man, a man that never used liquor in any way, nor never used tobacco in any way. But he was a man that overreached himself in everything that he done. He would buy anything he could get on credit. And
Sounds like a modern man.
yeah, and so Mr. Chapin bought from Mr. Williams Cascadel. Whether he ever paid anything for it or not, any more than work, he was a bookkeeper for Williams. Nobody has ever known, but anyway, Mr. Chapin filed homesteads there himself, and he got an old German by the name of Charlie Grunegreger
Oh, an unusual name.
to file a homestead there. At any rate, he got title to, I think, 480 acres of land. And Mr. Chapin improved the place. He planted lots more apple trees, and he built a considerable fence, and he built a very large barn that he didn't have much use for. And he lived there with his wife for many years, but during the time that he was supervisor, he handled the office of supervisor very much like he handled his own business. He hired men to work on the road and didn't have money to pay them. And when the next election come along, why, nobody just disputed Mr. Chapin's integrity or his ability or questioned his being anything but a good man, except that they couldn't afford to work for nothing.
I see.
And that defeated Mr. Chapin.
Okay.
And so soon after that, why, he lost Cascadel and moved back to Madera with his wife, and he was the head bookkeeper for the first bank in Madera, the Commercial National Bank. He was the head bookkeeper for many years there until he got so old that he couldn't work anymore. And, well, now another interesting part of Cascadel is the tramway that was brought down the mountain in the year 1887. Started in 1897, started in 96, I think it was. That was up on the top of the hill and very fine sugar pine timber, and just about a mile due east of Cascadel. But the country sets on age there, and that mile is, the elevation raises from about 3,500 feet to about 5,500 feet in
In a
just
mile.
perhaps a little bit more than a mile. Well, there had been two brothers, Ed Hebron and Dan Hebron, who had taken up 160 acres of land and had, it's a homestead act,
Oh, yeah.
and had made final proof on it and had title to the land. Well, they encumbered the land to the old Commercial National Bank of Madera, and in the course of a couple of years, why, the bank took it over. The bank took it over, I've always understood, for $500. Nowadays, there would be $500,000 worth of timber on it.
Oh, yeah. This is before any had been taken off.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, the bank interested Mr. J.W. Watkins and Fred Prosser. Watkins was a builder and a contractor and quite a good businessman in Madera. Prosser owned a lot of property over in what is now the Hughes addition to Madera, and was quite a man. And they got together and was to cut this timber and to build a tramway down the hill to Cascadel to deliver it at Cascadel. That saved about a 5-mile haul around it the way that it would have to go, and there was no road. They made just a little temporary road to take machinery in, but to have made a road that they could haul lumber on would have cost a lot of money. So they got the flume operating, or the tramway operating, in the summer of 1897. They had several little cars that would hold about 2,000 feet, and they got a large hoist, set it up at the mill, and that hoist was to let the lumber down and to hoist the cars back again.
I see.
Well, they also interested the Peckinpah brothers of the Peckinpah Lumber Company to move their mill from the old Peckinpah site, which is mostly northeast of North Fork, over about 5 miles to what's called the Watkins Mill. And he was to do the cutting for so much 1,000 and furnish the power to run this hoist to let the lumber. They didn't need no power to let it down, but they needed a lot to bring it back, bring the cars back.
Sure was.
Well, they didn't figure very correctly, but it soon developed that when there was a couple of cars down at Cascadel, why, they undertook to pull them up, well, they didn't have steam enough to saw with.
Oh, so they had to do one or the other.
They had to do one or the other.
I see.
So it was just a case that they couldn't saw any lumber while the cars were coming up. Well, so they alternated. They'd saw for 1 hour, and then they lay off for an hour while they got some cars up. And they went broke. Peckinpahs, I guess, lost 2 or 3 years' work there, and Watkins and Prosser both went broke. They didn't have nothing when they got through. Peckinpahs, I expect half or quite a bit of the timber was sawed up by the Watkins and Prosser, but when they couldn't move any longer, why, Peckinpah took over what timber there was left and built a wagon road through by what was then called Ellis Meadow. That Ellis, by the way, was no kinfolks of mine.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
And they built about 5 miles of road and hauled the lumber out with mule teams.
That way, huh?
And they got through there in about 1900, I think it was, and nobody had made any money to speak of.
Just a lot of work.
Just a lot of work.
Do you know how it happened to be called Ellis Meadow?
Well, yes, I know how it happened. the North Fork Lumber Company, that's another story. We'll get them together someday, maybe.
Okay.
But they were, in early days in the 90s and around there was few people that had any money to invest in anything.
That's right.
And there were few banks that wanted to loan money on little sawmills, little projects. If they had a big project like the old Sugar Pine Lumber Company used to be, or the California Lumber Company, and had thousands and thousands of acres of good timber, then they could borrow money.
Yeah.
But if they just had 160 acres of timber, why, no bank would look at them.
Yeah.
And so the two head men of the North Fork Lumber Company, after it had been running for 3 or 4 years, they had no trouble selling and getting rid of their best stuff, such as the best sugar pine and Ponderosa pine. But sawmilling in this country, in order to get the good, they've got to take some of the bad.
Mm.
The red fir and the white fir and the incense cedar is not bad lumber, but then it's not good lumber. It does for heavy building purposes and things like that, but not for any finishing work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this B.F. Ellis, his name was Benjamin Franklin Ellis.
Oh.
He was a contractor in Fresno, and he took contracts to build raising packing sheds and livery stables and that kind of rough work, you know. And he could use a lot of cheap lumber. So they took him as a partner. And he was with them for a few years. Well, he was with them until they went broke. And
that seems to be the story of
yeah,
everybody up in
yeah.
this country.
He started in to take up a homestead on Ellis Meadows. He had a log cabin there and lived there a little while. Now at the Ellis Meadows, it's now called Benedict's Meadows.
Yeah.
Why, there was very fine timber there and a very fine meadow.
There's a great big tree up there they call
Yes.
the Ellis tree.
Yes,
Is
yes,
that from
yes,
near there?
yes. Well, now, I think I just as well explain this. There has always been a question in the early days. They took up land under the Homestead Act. I have just told you about the Hebron brothers taking up 160 acres of land and making final proof on it and getting a legitimate title to the land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now without mentioning any more names, there was lots of other people that did the same thing.
Yeah.
And that was absolutely against the law, because in order to make final proof on a homestead, they had to go into the land office, which was then located in Stockton, and at least the applicant or the homesteader and 2 witnesses had to make affidavits that the land was worth more for agricultural purposes than it was for timber and stone.
Oh.
You
That-
see?
I see.
Now, a great deal of that land was in about that time, they began to be a lot of questions about that. It got back to Washington, and the forest authorities in Washington, there was no Forest Service nor no Forest Reserve in those days, and but that was being practiced all along the Sierra Nevada mountains here for 500 or 600 miles. And when you come to put it all together, there was a lot of it. And I think it was in 1895 or 96, Washington began to look into that. And they sent government men all along the forest here for many, many miles, investigated a lot of those homesteads, and canceled a lot of them.
They weren't using them at all for agriculture.
And Ellis was one that was canceled.
I
So,
see. So that.
I don't like to talk about that. Can you turn it off a minute?
Start that again. You were 16 when you started.
I was 16 years old when I started.
What was your first job on the lumber end of
Well,
it?
my first job, I had been raised on a ranch, and